All right, hello, my name's Grace, and it's been a really long time, wow. So, I believe I made a couple of videos a couple of years ago during quarantine when I came home, I want to say my sophomore year during college, and now I'm a senior. Oh, and my camera is focusing. Okay. I think it might do that. I'm using an old camera because my camera that I use normally is actually at school. So this is quite the learning curve for me as well. But I was looking back on the year and I was thinking about all the things that have happened to me and what everything has been kind of accumulating now until this moment, and it just felt like I needed to recap my year, which I'm gonna do in like actual recap videos because I've had such a crazy 2022. But also, like, ever since I went to college, I never felt qualified to be like a content creator about books anymore because that's not something that I had done maybe since like the age of 16 or 17. And at the latter end of my high school years, I really got into photography and really was pursuing that wholeheartedly. And most of the free time that I'd spent was, number one, hanging out with people, number two, exploring Washington State and Seattle. I used to sign myself out of school sometimes because I wanted to go hiking or something like that. But it's all fine. I still made it to college. Yeah, like I didn't really necessarily feel like I was the most qualified book creator out there, just given the fact that I wasn't like super involved anymore, not following all like the new releases or communicating with my favorite authors. And so I just kind of tapered off on making content. And then when I went to college, I was just like focused on being a college student and like meeting people, figuring out a career, and I still don't know what I want to do with my life, so I never achieved that goal. But yeah, I just didn't really feel as connected to BookTube, and now like Bookstagram is a whole thing, Book Talk is a whole thing, and I just feel really ancient and old in a lot of those ways. But I look back on this year and it just makes me so happy to see that people are really still reading. Like, I've always heard this like bullshit about, oh, like people are gonna stop reading books and it's just gonna be like a whole thing, and it's like I never stopped reading. I certainly read a lot different. I don't read the same things that I used to read like when I was a teenager. Some things I still do, but I meant like I read a shit ton of like scholarly literature and things for school now, so. But like I still managed to read a lot this year, which made me really happy to realize and made me very happy to hear. So I'm going to recap the books that I read because it's quite a funny mixture, and I find that quite hysterical, and I hope that you would find that entertaining as well. So yeah. This is Grace from 2022, and I would like to highlight while I'm editing this video that I said that these were all the books that I read in 2022, but I disregarded all of the nonfiction books that I read, like Why Carbs Are Bad for You. My brother was trying to convince me to go keto, and I think I still eat like a cookie every day, so I never went keto. Carbs are not bad for you, but I read a lot of nonfiction books I decided not to include, mainly because I also read some of them for school, but these are the novels that I read in 2022. So the books that I read in 2022, I have none of them with me because I'm at home in Seattle, and a lot of the books that I read are at my dorm room at university. So I'm actually currently reading this book by Emily Henry, and it's called Book Lovers. And it's essentially about this woman who works at a publishing house, and she and her arch nemesis, who also works in another publishing house, are competing, and it's like an enemies to lovers kind of love story, which I always really loved and really enjoy. I'm only like a quarter way through it, but I started the book while I was traveling in October. I was in Malta, actually. I remember pretty vividly. And the physical copy of the book is still in my dorm room, but I was solo traveling Malta. I saw this book in the bookstore and I just bought it, and I went to the beach and I read it, and I'm still like a quarter way through. I haven't picked up much of it. I started again on the plane back to Seattle, but yeah, I really like it this far. But we're actually talking books that I've fully completed this year. One book that I read was recommended to me by somebody who helped me on my junior paper at school, and this is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, if I said that correctly. This is the cover right here. And yeah, it's about like this futuristic world in which people buy companions and people are, you know, commodified in that regard. And we have Klara, who is kind of being rotated throughout this store and then accompanies this child, and kind of that story evolves. It's kind of like Humans, the British TV show, if you've ever seen that. And it was very interesting. It's not typically the type of book that I normally read, if that makes sense, because I, truth be told, love to get my entertainment in some of the most not necessarily unintellect. I love Love Island. I love trash reality TV. It's like some of my favorite TV in the world. And I also really love like rom-coms and romance and things like that, because it's quite entertaining. And so something like this is not something I normally read, as in like I spend so much time dedicating so much of my brain power to understanding the things that I read for school or understanding the things that I would read for my job. Like the last thing I wanted to do was pick up something that would be hard to understand. But this book was really lovely, and I read it mostly while I was in transit in May of this year. I was traveling Portugal and Italy, and I'd carried this book around with me, and it was a great conversation starter as well. So people would like ask me about what I was reading randomly, and it was nice. I read like every single Colleen Hoover book that came out. So that would be Reminders of Him, Heart Bones, Regretting You. I read all of them. So do I remember most of them? No, but actually I think the one that I remember most was Heart Bones. And also I think it's really important when you talk about things that you've read to not necessarily for like the commercialization effect of explaining everything that happens in the book. Like, what do you remember most from the text that you read? I think is something like really, really important to point out, which is something that I think I've kind of learned from being like a college student. Like, oh, after like, you know, the thousands of pages I read every single month, like what stands out to me most by the text that I've read. So Reminders of Him, I believe, was about a woman who like abandoned her husband on the side of the road. Maybe they weren't married, but like abandoned a love on the side of the road and goes back to find her kid after being in jail. Oh, I'm going out of focus again. Oh no. Okay, so yeah, basically she goes and tries to find her kid because she has a child, and admitted to being guilty and went into jail, and a couple of years later I think falls in love with his best friend or something like that. It was very interesting. I particularly like Colleen Hoover because I think she explores the dark side of romance really well, and that it's not always dandelions and roses, and this was a particularly really great novel. And I think part of like one of my qualms about romance books is that sometimes I can't necessarily I really like the plot. I really like the plot of a love story, less so like the romantic scenes or the smut, as some people call it. So I really like the build up to like, you know, someone falling in love, or the build up of two people falling together. And that's really entertaining for me to read. So that's why I really like Colleen Hoover. And I also read, let's see, Heart Bones, which is about a girl who goes to this vacation town and falls in love with who she thinks is this really rich guy who has a bachelor pad or something like that, but like falls in love with someone who she thinks she knows who he is, and then he turns out to be something that he's not. It's like the quintessential summer away from home novel, and you get to see what happens, which is really nice and entertaining. Particularly because like on the one hand, I travel a lot, but I've never spent like a stationary summer at a beach town like that. So I think it's very like the Summer I Turned Pretty-esque, but very dark. It's obviously much darker than the Summer I Turned Pretty, but I still really enjoyed it. And I think I read it on the plane way back in April or something when I flew home. So Regretting You, I think, was probably my least favorite out of the 3 books that I read by Colleen this year. But it's about a mother and a daughter and like their parallel love stories. Obviously there's a lot of chaos involved. And again, I appreciate that Colleen shows us a lot of what it means to be part of a dysfunctional family. I think that's like really important to kind of highlight, because no one's perfect, and there are always like small parts of every book that I kind of relate to. Not that my family is entirely dysfunctional, but I'm like, oh yeah, like my mom and I used to like fight about that, like, oh, like I've had a conversation with a friend like that before, and it's just like really nice to, I think, see those like real pieces of life that are highlighted in between the romance, versus I think there are some romance novels that are truly like you want to escape the world, and like there's a time and place for those, and I have read some of those this year, which I'll mention now. All right, so I read It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey, and I also read the sequel, which I'm forgetting the name about, but it was the spin-off of the 2 characters from this book. This book was like the definition of like fun, fresh, and flirty, and I also particularly love that it was like set in Washington State. I don't know what it is about fiction novels and being set in Washington State or Seattle, but like that's just been like a super, super popular place. I think like Stephanie Meyer did Twilight here, After Anna Todd was all set in Seattle. Very, very interesting that there's a lot of Seattle fiction being set here. But yeah, this woman named Piper is like, you know, a spoiled brat, and then she gets sent to this fisher town in Seattle and like falls in love with a hunk there, and it was so much fun. Yeah, and I really love this book. It was so flirty, and like the characters are just so humorous. Like it's entirely unrealistic, but you love it at the same time. I also read the spin-off book, which was about her sister, and also really loved it. This was like, these are feel-good books. Don't have to dedicate a lot to reading them, and they fly by really quickly. I also think that I read this one on the plane as well. I like to read a lot on the plane. Like that's when I have time to like really sit down and read for fun and not for school. I spend most of my time reading for school. And then I also read The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which got turned into a movie, which I didn't really like. The movie was not that good, and I think it's because they didn't do the dynamics of the characters correctly. But these are two co-workers who are enemies and then end up falling in love. And yes, I love the enemies to lover arch. It's my favorite trope. So if you saw the movie and wanted to read the book, do not get discouraged, because I didn't like the movie. The movie wasn't good, but the book, I loved the book. I also read People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, and these are like two best friends, I believe, who like have a planned vacation together every single year, and like they're dating people and like each other is in love with each other, and then they eventually fall in love, which is the premise of the book. It's very predictable, but it's very lovely, and I also really loved this book. I like, again, the cheesy, sometimes there's a time and place for it. Now I'm going to mention some of the books that I read for school. Like I read a lot of like articles and different like chapters of things at school, but like whole novels that I read at school, these are the ones. I read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is about, you know, dystopia and surrogacy and things like that. There's a huge TV show on it. Very scary novel. It really tells you a lot about what the future could be, and I think that's really terrifying. Yeah, I read this for an English class on conspiracy. There are a lot of waves of paranoia that I think are similar in the characters to what goes on in The Handmaid's Tale versus actually what goes on in today's world, which is crazy. So, and for another book in that class, I also read The Crying a Lot 49, which is by Thomas Pynchon. It's another dystopian novel. It's a much older book. I honestly, quite frankly, do not remember a lot from this book. I skimmed it very heavily for class. I just really needed to like have a point of discussion for it because I was slightly presenting on it. It has a very satirical take on just different cities and real life things. Like they make fun of like Los Angeles, they make fun of the materialism there, and it's a very emerging phenomenon at that point in time when the book was written. So I think it was a commentary on cultural phenomenons way ahead of its time, which was really, really awesome to read. I also read Severance by Ling Ma, which was a very interesting novel in that I think it had a lot of great, I think, commentary as well on like repetition and doing things for others and appearance, which I think is always going to be relevant in conversation that goes on in today's society. I don't really remember much of the premise of the book actually anymore, but I just remember like really being shook by all of the details and the commentary on like societal phenomenons and like caring about beauty and appearance and things like that. And I read that in a different English class. That was for this class called Wounded Beauty, and it was about like beauty tropes and women and things across like classical literature, which was really awesome. I also read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong for that same English class, and that was about an Asian American who kind of goes through these like really hard events in his life, like discovers his homosexuality. This was like one of the saddest books ever for me to read. However, like I really like the writing style. It's very unique, and also there are some quotes in the book that you kind of just like will remember. I would recommend this as a read if you want to read something different and eye-opening. And last book that I will mention in today's video is Passing by Nella Larsen. This is actually now a movie on Netflix if you want to watch it, but this is about a woman who is living in the 1920s, passing as a white woman. You're following the course of two women. One is trying to act like a white person in society, and the other is as a black woman. So you get to see those kind of two forces competing against one another. It's a very short read, and it was actually one of my favorite books that I've ever read at Princeton. It was one of the best books that I've ever read for a class, period. And so I wrote multiple essays in that class on the novel because it was one of the ones that I read from cover to cover very closely and didn't skim at all. So that's also another factor. But yeah, those are the books that I read this year in 2022. It's been a really, really crazy year. I'm very excited to hopefully read more this upcoming year. I'm definitely going to try to, at least. I'm saying that now, I'm documenting it, so hopefully. But thanks so much for watching, and there's more to come. There's a real 2022 recap to come, so yeah.